When you think of someone wearing black in our modern world, you may think of someone who presents as goth, emo, or even punk. But why? How did this color become so symbolic and so noticeable as an expression of character and identity? Black has carried meanings far beyond the subcultures we associate it with today. It represented mourning, religion, wealth, authority, elegance, restraint, and rebellion. So, how did one color carry all this meaning? Let's talk about it. Black is often treated as the absence of color, but across centuries, people have gone to considerable lengths to produce it, wear it, and give it meaning. It has appeared in royal courts and monasteries, in mourning rituals and formal dress, in paintings, and countercultures. Its meaning has never been completely fixed. The same color that could signify wealth and status in one period could represent grief in another, and eventually become a symbol of rebellion or personal identity. So why black? Why has this particular color carried so much symbolic weight for so long? To answer that, it helps to look at the history of the color itself, and at the different people and institutions that have chosen to give it meaning. In medieval Europe, the feat of producing a deep, durable black was not always easy. The quality of black depended heavily on the dyeing process and the materials involved. A black textile that remained rich and dark, instead of fading toward a brown or blue, could be a sign of particularly fine workmanship. That mattered because clothing was one of the most visible ways of displaying wealth during this era. By the late Middle Ages, black had already developed several different associations. It could suggest mourning or religious seriousness, but it could also be luxurious. Black garments made from expensive materials such as velvet could appear remarkably rich, particularly when combined with the elaborate tailoring and textiles available to wealthy Europeans. By the 15th and 16th centuries, black had become especially prominent in the courts of Burgundy and Spain. The Spanish Habsburg court had become strongly associated with a severe prevalence of black clothing. Under rulers such as Philip II, dressing darkly could communicate gravity, authority, restraint, and serious commitment to Catholicism. This wasn't simply because black had one universally understood meaning. Court fashion was helping to create that meaning. Black could make expensive fabric appear more austere, it could suppress visual excess while still allowing the quality of the material and tailoring to speak for itself. That combination became very important. Black could look powerful without needing to look extravagant. Religion, especially, had become a key reinforcement of some of these associations. Many clergy and monastic communities used black clothing as part of visual language for discipline, humility, and renunciation, although practices varied considerably between different orders and periods. The result was that black accumulated meanings rather than replacing one meaning with another. It could be solemn, it could be wealthy, it could be religious, it could be authoritative, and those associations would continue the modern period. And now, by the 19th century, black had become deeply connected with mourning in Britain and elsewhere in Europe and North America. Victorian mourning was not simply an emotional response to death. It became a highly visible social practice with conventions governing clothing, jewelry, etiquette, and even printed materials. For widows in particular, mourning was often divided into stages. The earliest and most restrictive period was commonly called deep or full mourning. During this period, clothing was expected to be overwhelmingly black, and heavy crêpe became one of the most defining materials. Crêpe had a dull, crinkled surface that absorbed rather than reflected light. Its appearance helped distinguish mourning clothing from ordinary fashionable dress. Veils were common, particularly for women, and jewelry was heavily restricted. One of the most characteristic materials was jet, a naturally occurring black material related to a coal that could be polished into mourning jewelry. Hair work was another way of turning mourning into something tangible. Hair from the deceased could be incorporated into jewelry or other keepsake, allowing an object to function simultaneously as an ornament and a memorial. As mourning progressed, the rules generally became less severe. Black remained dominant, but fabrics and decoration could become somewhat lighter. Eventually, half mourning allowed colors such as gray, white, mauve, or lavender to appear alongside black. The exact duration and rules varied according to the relationship to the deceased, social position, period, and individual circumstances. There were no singular timetable that every Victorian followed. On the contrary, a man's mourning was generally more restrained. A man may wear a black suit or any dark formal clothing, along with a black armband or a hat band. Even stationery and calling cords could be edged in black. Black therefore became more of a private expression of grief. It was something that other people could read and silently understand without having to ever utter a word. The clothing could communicate that a death had occurred, how recently it had happened, and whether the survivor was observing the expected conventions. Queen Victoria had become one of the most famous examples of this culture. After Prince Albert died in 1861, she wore mourning for the remainder of her life. Although the intensity and style of her mourning changed over time, her public devotion to mourning helped reinforce blacks' association with grief and solemnity during the height of the Victorian era. And this is important for the history of black. The color is becoming associated with controlled emotion. Grief was expected to be visible, but it was also expected to be disciplined. The clothing created a boundary between ordinary life and mourning. Private loss became something that could be publicly recognized through appearance. That association between black and restraint would survive long after the Victorian mourning customs had begun to disappear. At roughly the same time, black was developing another important role. It was becoming the color of formal and professional respectability. By the 19th century, men's dress had increasingly moved towards dark, restrained tailoring. Black had become particularly important for formal suits, especially evening dress and professional clothing, although dark navy and other colors also played major roles. The modern black suit therefore inherited some of the seriousness that had already accumulated around the color. A black suit does not need to be visually complicated. Its effects come partly from its restraint. It can make the wearer appear formal without drawing attention away from the person wearing it. This is one reason black survived so easily when many other 19th century fashion conventions disappeared. The morning dress eventually became less common, the religious associations became less universal, but the visual language of seriousness remained. Black could still suggest that an occasion mattered. By the 20th century, black had begun to move into very different territory. One of the most famous examples came from fashion. In 1926, American Vogue featured one of Coco Chanel's simple black dresses and compared its potential popularity to that of the Ford automobile. That comparison was significant. The black little dress presented black as something practical, modern, and widely adaptable. Black no longer had to be associated with mourning to appear appropriate. It could appear elegant precisely because it was simple. Chanel's approach to clothing emphasized function, simplicity, and clean silhouettes. And the black little dress became one of the defining garments of 20th century fashion. Black could now work almost anywhere. It could be formal, it could be casual, it could be inexpensive or luxurious, it could disappear into the background or become the entire point of an outfit. And that flexibility would become even more important as fashion moved beyond traditional social rules. By the middle of the 20th century, black was increasingly adopted by groups that wanted to distinguish themselves from mainstream culture. Beatniks in the 1950s became associated with dark clothing, black turtlenecks, and a deliberately pared-down appearance. Their clothing was a part of a broader rejection of the conventional middle-class presentation. Punk then later on pushed the idea much further. Beginning in the 1970s, punk fashion used black leather, distressed clothing, hardware, boots, and deliberately confrontational combinations of materials. Black was particularly useful for this because it already carried associations with seriousness and authority. Punk could take those associations and distort them. The color of formal respectability could become the color of refusal. Black leather, metal hardware, torn fabric, and deliberately damaged clothing created a visual language that challenged conventional ideas about what clothing was supposed to accomplish. Punk wasn't simply one unified fashion movement, and black wasn't the only color it used. But black became one of its most recognizable visual elements. And this is where the history becomes especially interesting. Black could now communicate opposite things depending on who was wearing it. A black suit could suggest conformity and professionalism. A black leather jacket could suggest rebellion. The color itself hadn't changed. The context had. Now, let's discuss a subculture that is commonly associated with black today. Goth. By the late 1970s and 1980s, goth developed out of the post-punk environment and gave black an even more elaborate visual image. Goth fashion itself drew from several different sources: punk, Victorian clothing, romantic imagery, religious symbolism, and theatrical dressing, as well as, but not limited to, older ideas surrounding death and mourning. Black became almost architectural. Long coats, lace, boots, tailored clothing, veils, dramatic silhouettes, and dark makeup could all contribute to the same visual world. And some of the most interesting elements were historical references. Victorian mourning clothing could be reinterpreted as fashion. Formal tailoring could become theatrical, religious imagery could be detached from its original setting and turn into something aesthetic. The result was a subculture in which black could communicate melancholy, beauty, distance, mystery, or simply belonging. It is also significant that goth returned to the same historical imagery that had helped create black's earlier associations. Mourning never completely disappeared, it was transformed. The veil, the black long dress, the formal coat, the jet-like ornamentation, the old-fashioned silhouette, these could all be removed from their original context and given new meanings. Black had become flexible enough to carry history with it. Fashion isn't the only place where black developed this kind of symbolic power. Paintings has its own history of using darkness to control attention. Caravaggio, working in the late 16th and early 17th centuries, became famous for dramatic contrast between light and dark. This is often described through the terms chiaroscuro and particularly his later work, tenebrism. Rather than simply filling a painting with black, Caravaggio used darkness to isolate figures, intensify gestures, and create psychological and dramatic tension. The darkness becomes part of the composition. It determines what the viewer sees first. It can make a face emerge suddenly from a surrounding space, or make an ordinary room feel almost theatrical. Centuries later, artists continued to question what black could do on its own. Mark Rothko's later work included paintings dominated by extremely dark fields, where subtle differences in tone and surface could become more important than recognizable imagery. Ad Reinhardt pushed this even further with a late series of almost entirely black paintings. At first glance, they can appear completely empty, but when viewed closely, their surface contains subtle variations in structures. The black isn't simply a hole in the painting, it becomes the painting. This creates an interesting parallel with fashion. In both cases, black can reduce visual noise, it can remove obvious decoration and force attention toward texture, shape, light, surface, and context. Black doesn't necessarily tell the viewer what to think, it creates an environment in which the viewer has to pay attention. Today, black carries all of these histories simultaneously. A black dress can still be associated with mourning, a black suit can communicate professionalism, a black garment can suggest luxury or minimalism. It can belong to punk, goth, metal, streetwear, high fashion, religious dress, or everyday clothing. Sometimes it means almost nothing at all, and that might be a part of its strength. Black is unusually good at adapting to context. It can absorb other meanings without completely losing its own identity. The associations built over centuries are still there in the background. When we see someone dressed entirely in black, we don't necessarily think of mourning, but the color's history with mourning, seriousness, formality, and restraint has never completely disappeared. The same is true of rebellion. Someone wearing black isn't necessarily making a statement against society, but black has been repeatedly adopted by groups that are interested in rejecting convention. The possibility is still part of the visual language. Meaning accumulates, it doesn't simply replace what came before. So, why black? Because very few colors have been asked to do as much. It has been a color of mourning and ceremony, wealth and restraint, professionalism and rebellion. It has been worn by monarchs, clergy, workers, artists, punks, goths, and people who simply wanted something that looked good. Its history is contradictory. Black can conceal and emphasize. It can make something disappear or make something impossible to ignore. It can communicate seriousness without explanation, and perhaps that's why it has endured. Black is visually simple, but symbolically dense. Its meaning depends on who wears it, where it appears, and what came before it. It is easy to mistake black for emptiness. Historically, it has rarely ever been empty. It is a color people have repeatedly chosen when they want something to carry weight. And after centuries of doing exactly that, black has become one of the most consistent, constant carriers of meaning in visual culture. So, after all of this history, what do we actually do with it? We can start by recognizing that black doesn't have one fixed meaning. When you see someone dressed entirely in black, you might immediately associate it with goth, punk, emo, mourning, formality, or something else entirely. But none of those interpretations exist in isolation. They are built from centuries of associations that have accumulated around the color. The black clothing worn by a Victorian widow and the black clothing worn by a modern goth may have absolutely nothing to do with each other on the surface. But visually, they can still share the same language. Both can create distance from ordinary dress. Both can communicate seriousness. Both can make the wearer appear deliberately removed from the expected presentation of everyday life. The meaning has changed, but the visual power remains. And I think that's the most interesting thing about black. We often talk about clothing as though it simply reflects who someone already is. But clothing can also construct how someone wants to be perceived. A person can use black to appear more formal, more mysterious, more severe, more understated, or simply more comfortable within a certain identity. The color doesn't tell us exactly who that person is, it gives us a suggestion. And that suggestion is powerful because we already carry centuries of associations with us. So when you choose to wear black, you're participating in a visual language that existed long before you did. You don't have to consciously think about mourning, religion, royalty, punk, or goth culture every time you put on a black shirt. Most of the time, you probably aren't thinking about any of these things. But the history is still there. That's what makes symbolism interesting. Symbols don't need to be consciously understood in order to influence how we see something. Black has survived because it can carry all of these meanings without permanently being trapped by any of them. It can be elegant without being formal. It can be dark without being depressing. It can be rebellious without being aggressive. It can be simple without being empty. And perhaps that's why black remains visually powerful. It leaves room for the person wearing it to decide what it means. So, why black? Maybe there isn't one answer. Maybe that's exactly the point. For centuries, people have continued to take this color and give it new meanings. And every generation adds something of its own. Black has been used to mourn the dead, demonstrate authority, express faith, simplify fashion, reject convention, create art, and construct identity. It has changed constantly while somehow remaining recognizable. And that is what makes black simply more than a color. It has become a language of restraint, absence, elegance, rebellion, mourning, and of identity. What that language says depending on the person using it. But after centuries of history, one thing is certain. Black has never really been empty.